Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is David T. Beito. Last name is spelled Beito. He's just published a new book. If you're watching this on one of my three YouTube channels, which magically reappeared in the last couple months, or on X, Twitter, or on Rumble, or on Rockfin, you'll see the cover of his new book, FDR: New Political Life. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A lot of opinions on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, good and bad. So we're going to address some of those. But it's not the first time I've talked to him. I talked to him back in 2024 about his book, The New Deal's Way, War on the Bill of Rights. So you can go back and check that out. He is a professor emeritus. I'm going to read his bio. Currently, he's a research fellow at the Independent Institute and professor emeritus of history at the University of Alabama. He received his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin, and he is the recipient of the Ellis Hawley Prize. He's also the author of Taxpayers in Revolt, Tax Resistance During the Great Depression, From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, also Fraternal Societies and Social Services, 1890 and 1967, and then with T.R.M. Howard, Dr. Entrepreneur and Civil Rights Pioneer. He's also the former president of the Alabama Scholars Association and chair of the Alabama State Advisory Committee of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He's the founder of the Liberty and Power blog at the History News Network, and he's published in many academic journals. His articles have appeared in Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Washington Times, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Perspectives, History News Network, National Review, Reason, and elsewhere. But again, we're going to talk about this book and a very important and interesting character, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the title again is FDR: A New Political Life. So David Beito, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much.
For people
who last time.
Great. Well, I'm glad. I love return guests and I love these topics. So especially with an accomplished historian such as yourself, for people who may not have heard our earlier interview, maybe you can talk a little bit about your background, your interest in FDR, the publication of your earlier books, and what led up to the research and publication of your new book, FDR.
I'm a real generalist. I've written about a lot of different aspects of American history, mostly focused on the 20th century. And the 1930s has always fascinated me. My PhD was about tax revolts during the Great Depression. And then I did a book on mutual aid, how Americans provided for themselves before the rise of the welfare state. And a lot of that focused on the Great Depression. And Franklin Roosevelt himself has always been a fascinating figure to me. So I wrote this book several years ago. You interviewed me, focusing just on FDR and the Bill of Rights, really the New Deal and the Bill of Rights. But out of that, somebody contacted me and say, hey, would you like to write a full-scale bio of FDR? And I jumped at the opportunity. So that's what this is. It's concise, but I think I do pack a lot of stuff in the length. And so I think it would be good for course adoptions, as a matter of fact. If somebody wanted to have a perspective that maybe is a little bit different, even as a foil, and it's affordable. So I ended up getting into FDR, the full gamut, economic policy during World War II, his early life, and it was a lot of fun. And he is quite a character, and I never got bored with him. I didn't really come out as a big admirer of FDR, but he never bored me.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. One of the interesting aspects of your book is like some of the people who comment. I like the comments of his son Elliot, who kind of knew him firsthand. But he really was, I think that with his charisma, I don't know if he would be considered really a serious academic or scholar, even though he had a law degree, right?
Yeah, and FDR was not an intellectual. Now, he was influenced by ideas. So I'm not someone who says, oh, he didn't care about ideas. He just did whatever he wanted to or whatever seemed to work. No, he had an ideological default. Having said that, he was not a reader. He did not, people would just say this guy didn't read books. He was more interested in his stamp collection, and he would spend hours on that. He was interested in yachting. he was interested in these kinds of gentlemanly pursuits. And he wasn't someone who would be sitting down reading a lot of books. He might do light reading. He liked spy novels, apparently. But again, he's not a great intellectual by any means. He has tremendous charisma, however. There's no doubt about that. And his speaking style is very disarming and very effective. I think you could make some interesting comparisons between him and Trump. And frankly, he comes off better in terms of stylistically than Trump, I think. He's more effective in getting what he wants.
I think you're right. And you mentioned in your book, he was kind of a little bit more, had nuances to his character in that he was kind of vindictive, it seemed like, but he'd do it in secret, and he would kind of use underhanded. And also, his speeches were more effective. Like you say, his "We have no fear but fear itself" speech, I think it was 32, was among the top 5 American speeches, right?
Well, that's what historians, often rank it that way. But it's interesting if you go back in time to when that speech was first given. That line was not the main thing people keyed into on that speech. The main thing that generated the most commentary were his comments in that speech that we may need emergency powers, and if Congress won't do its job, we may need to go down that road. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the newsreel coverage of that speech, it was his inauguration address. It tended to focus on that part of the speech, and the whole part of the speech about fear. All we have to fear is fear itself. That's kind of like, okay, that's interesting, but people didn't really key into that at the time. So it's interesting how, in retrospect, that is the only thing many people remember about that speech, where at the time it really wasn't what resonated as much.
It's interesting. It's a good soundbite. I guess that maybe that's the whole thing, is that people can key into that. But he almost, his political career was almost ruined because of a scandal that I didn't really know about. Can you talk about that? It was I think it was the new something scandal. I can't remember the name.
Newport sex scandal.
Newport sex scandal. Yeah.
This not only almost ruined his career, it kind of, if you take FDR's word for it, kind of changed the whole trajectory of his life. He overcame this in some ways, but in some ways, it had a permanent effect on him. FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Like his cousin, Ted, who he looked up to. His uncle called him Uncle Ted, even though he was his cousin. He had a very similar career trajectory. He served in the New York State Legislature, and then on the strength of that, he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration. And there was a low-level investigation during those years at one of the naval bases in Newport. Some guy sort of took it upon himself to investigate same-sex relationships in the Navy among the sailors, with the goal of exposing this and forcing them out. Right. In this investigation, only languished. They couldn't get support from the Attorney General or anything. And Roosevelt found out about it. He says, "I'll support your investigation." Not only that, he took leadership of the investigation. Roosevelt headed something called Section A. And it really reflected his fascination with spying. But I also think he saw it as, this is a great ticket to a political career, right? Because he's going to run for office. He's going to run, he's going to move into national politics. He already is. So rooting out gays from the Navy seemed like probably a smart political move, seemed like. Well, Section A sort of, there weren't a lot of scruples about methods. Let's put it that way. And a lot of the investigators in Section A would entrap people. And by entrapping, here's what I'm talking about. They would engage in same-sex relationships with people they were investigating as a means to catch them. And this was excused later by, they did it for their country, right? And the investigation used these kinds of entrapment methods. Eventually, it really kind of these there started to be a lot of arrests, and people were caught up in it. And it became there was a big backlash against it. A local paper in Providence really went after it and blamed Roosevelt and said this guy's out of control. Eventually, the U.S. Senate investigated, and this was headline news in the New York Times. And it found Roosevelt responsible for these abuses. And yes, despite the fact that, people are not very pro same-sex relationship, to say the least, during the time, this was going too far, even for people at the time. And there's a headline in the New York Times that blames F.D. Roosevelt for this. Said he's the man responsible, and he said he was unfit for office. This is U.S. Senate committee. And a lot of people thought his career was over with. But the timing wasn't bad. At the time, President Harding is picking his cabinet. There are other issues in the news. And he kind of skirts, right? And it's sort of forgotten. However, it is not forgotten by FDR, because only a few weeks after the Senate report, which FDR was extremely upset about, only a few weeks after that, FDR came down with his paralysis. And he blamed the Senate committee. He blamed the Senate committee for the rest of his life for his paralysis. And his argument was, and he might have been right, who knows, that it had been caused by tainted water when he had visited a Boy Scout jamboree. This is one of the more incredible theories. And but the reason it had such an effect is because he had, again, a lot of people would say, he had lowered immunity. He was depressed. He was, not getting a lot of sleep. He was very worried about this Senate investigation. So he blamed the Senate investigation. So it puts a new take on that aspect of his life, where people have often focused, and I think for some good reason, on the heroic aspects of that, of him overcoming this disability that afflicted him for the rest of his life. But that's a part of the story that's pretty well documented, but again, hasn't been written a lot about.
It really hasn't. And I think one of the other aspects too is the ongoing kind of race relations with FDR and African Americans really started early. So that concern was always a part of it's either in the foreground or in the background of his whole political career. Would you agree with that?
Well, when he becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy, his boss, the secretary, and at the time, of course, the Navy is a cabinet post. His boss, Josephus Daniels, is one of the most notorious racists in the South. He had basically overthrown a kind of multiracial government in North Carolina through kind of violent methods. He was a newspaper editor, but he had stoked up these passions. So his president is Woodrow Wilson, who's a segregationist. And Wilson says, I'm going to bring in Jim Crow into the federal government, or segregation. Josephus Daniels, if anything, wants to go further than Wilson. And Roosevelt really doesn't care. But Roosevelt will do it. He will implement what his boss wants. They bring in a very detailed policy of segregated bathrooms in Naval Department facilities, including a watch force to monitor it, to make sure that there were no lines crossed. And Roosevelt sort of in charge of that. Later, there are these really horrible race riots during a period called Red Summer, which is 1919, where white sailors pull black, sailors and black streetcar riders off of streetcars and assault them. And it's just an out of control race riots. And it gets so bad that, people are demanding that the Secretary of the Navy, do something about this, that he send in forces, send in the Marines or whatever to patrol. He doesn't do anything. Roosevelt writes to a friend during this period. He sort of jokes about it. He writes to a friend from the South, from Georgia, and says, "We need some Southerners like you up here who can handle Negroes." So is he a racist? Well, yeah, I would say so, but he is. It just doesn't. I think the thing about Roosevelt, he just doesn't really care about those issues. He does care about other things, though. He's downright insubordinate as assistant secretary in trying to push for sort of provocative moves because he does want to get in the war. His boss in the Navy Department does not want to get in, but Roosevelt does. So he's pushing very hard, kind of belligerent policies in the Navy, just like his cousin did 2 decades before when he was assistant secretary. So it's very interesting the way he's mirroring the career of Uncle Ted in many interesting ways.
And didn't they both make it into the governorship of New York State? That seems to be a known springboard into the presidency, right?
Yeah, it's a remarkable parallel. Both are governors of New York. Both ran for vice president. Both were assistant secretary of the Navy. Both went to Harvard. So they had very similar backgrounds, and Franklin was aware of this, and he kind of emulated it. Now, he did not win when he ran for vice president, unlike Theodore, but in 1920 he lost, but everyone sort of thought he'd lose that election because Wilson was so unpopular. The Democrat who was running that year really felt that he had to, he couldn't break from Wilson, so Wilson just lost in the landslide. And I think Roosevelt knew that was going to happen, but then Roosevelt was a very young man. I don't think he was yet 40. And I think he saw this as setting up for his future career. Now, one interesting difference between him and Theodore is that when the Spanish-American War broke out, Theodore resigned as assistant secretary. He didn't just go, to join and be captain of a ship. He led his own infantry unit. He went into the thick of battle. And he thought in World War I that Franklin should do the same. And he pestered him, said, "Why aren't you volunteering?" Franklin was in his late 30s. And he would say things like, "Well, my boss and the president want me to stay at my post." Well, of course, they'd said the same thing about Theodore, and that hadn't stopped him. So somebody said he was a different kind of man. But he did not see military service.
But he kind of
Europe on a kind of tour, but he didn't really.
He kind of deceived people about it, though, right? Didn't he, David? Didn't he kind of say, "I've seen dead bodies"? I think you write about it in your book. Like he actually augmented his World War I career, saying that he was at the front lines when he wasn't really there. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was a tourist.
Yeah,
and he went there to visit American facilities, but most of this is behind the lines. I think he was able to shoot a gun, artillery, some artillery, weapons, and just it was kind of a. But then as he was visiting, sort of behind the lines a little bit, he would he visited relatives like cousins, the Astors, and it was a very touristy thing. Now, I think he probably saw some refugees fleeing. He probably saw some German prisoners and things like that. But it was very sanitized. It was behind the lines. So he didn't really experience the horrors of war in any genuine sense. But he gave this very famous speech in 1937 or 36. It was an election that year. And he said, "I have seen war. And then he goes into the thing, I've seen all this and I've seen all that. I hate war." And again, very much pumped it up, but his experiences during the war were more those of a kind of a tourist. I think it's fair to say.
Right. So he's 40 in 1920. He wins the New York governorship in 28. And then the crash it starts to happen. So he's literally in Wall Street or in Manhattan, right when this really cataclysmic event happens, right?
Yeah, and that aspect of his career in some ways is not played up enough because one of the early banking failures that occurs is a bank called the Bank of the United States, which isn't a government bank or anything like that, but it's a very important, very big bank, and it goes under. And there's a little bit of a scandal. It's kind of a complicated situation, but that is, that's under his watch as governor. And he really drops the ball on it in a lot of ways. But again, he has a lot of luck because people are going to blame, understandably, the president, for the Great Depression. Not for a guy, though, that, was arguably important in the whole banking crisis by ineptitude in supervising the Bank of the United States. Kind of had a sweetheart relationship with the officers of that bank, and it just collapsed and led to a chain reaction. But he was governor of New York during that period, and was kind of became the guy to beat. He had a lot of charisma. He had not alienated any significant element in the Democratic Party. So there are people on the left in the party that kind of think he's one of, they like him. And there are a lot of very conservative people in the party, perhaps more conservative than the Republicans in some cases, who like him too. And I think of Bill Clinton, they called it triangulation. But FDR is a pioneer in triangulation. And if you look at that 1932 election, it's just a work of art in the way that he's able to appeal to all these different elements. Although he would have won that election no matter what, because of the Great Depression. President Hoover is, definitely, the underdog during that whole campaign.
Didn't he win with like a very significant majority in 32?
Yes, it was a significant majority. And so he was very cautious the way he ran. I don't think he really needed to be, but he wasn't going to take any chances. So that may have increased his majority, maybe not. But if you look at him, one interesting thing people talk about is, well, the New Deal, right? Roosevelt did use that term during the campaign, but there's no real hint of what comes later during that campaign. In fact, he is often criticizing Hoover as too much of an interventionist. He says he's a big government guy. I want to cut spending 25%. At the same time, he's giving sort of hints to people on the left that he's going to be a bit different. But in a lot of ways, he runs a very conventional campaign, and there's no indication of what comes later with the New Deal. This big shift with these programs like the National Recovery Administration and these big New Deal initiatives. It would have been difficult based on what was said during that campaign to think anything like that was going to happen.
And you define like these in your book, these differences. You call it a first New Deal and a second New Deal. Why do you say that there were like two different sections to it?
Well, it's not original with me. That's in that way, I'm kind of a standard guy. But there are two different waves. And I think you can overplay how different they are. I think in a way it's mainly timing. But the first New Deal has programs, some of which don't survive, and some of which were really big at the time, the ones that people talked about the most, and now they don't get talked about as much, like the National Recovery Administration, which tries to bring in wage price controls for the whole country. People go to jail for charging too little to press a suit. It has minimum prices. And then the AAA, you're going out and you're paying farmers not to produce. You're trying to drive up prices. You're trying to drive up wages, because Roosevelt is like Hoover in that sense. Hoover had the same philosophy. They were actually very friendly to one another at one time, but they were what you would call underconsumptionists. They think that the Depression was caused by the fact that people weren't spending enough. They weren't able to buy enough. And so they have this policy of forcing up prices and forcing up wages, which has the effect, frankly, of backfiring, leading to unemployment, double-digit unemployment lasts for a decade. So you got the first New Deal, and those are two examples of the first New Deal, really two key examples. The second New Deal is where you get some things that are a bit more permanent. That's 1935. You get the big one there, probably in terms of permanence, is you get Social Security in 1935. That's not part of the first New Deal. So some historians have sort of said, well, the first New Deal is really to lift the U.S. out of the Depression. The second New Deal is more permanent changes. I don't know if I buy that, because I think FDR intended permanent changes from the beginning. But that's often the way it's framed, but it's also timing. There's the first New Deal is like the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration. The second New Deal is about 100 days in 1935. So they're both a kind of spurt of new initiatives.
New initiatives. One of the interesting things is this buyback of the gold that took place, and how kind of it seemed haphazard to me. Like, oh, we're just going to buy all the gold back, and like we're going to set a funny price because I like the number 21 cents. Like, what do you think that? Why do you think they did that, and what do you think the effect of that was?
Well, there was this economist who everyone has forgotten. In fact, I can't even remember what his name is now. That's how forgotten he is. But he was an economist from Cornell University, and this guy sort of had the theory that if you could raise the, if you could properly manipulate gold prices, you could also manipulate commodities, the price of commodities. You could control them in a certain sense. So Roosevelt would go through this cycle where he would buy gold, and he would get his key advisors together and said, okay, we're going to buy some gold today. And he would set the price. He would try to set the price of gold, which is, the international price of gold. He would try to kind of set that by essentially speculating in, the gold market, buying gold, selling gold, and so forth. And how did he decide, what the price of gold was going to be on a particular day? It was often very arbitrary. Roosevelt would say things like, let's make it $21 an ounce. And someone would ask him privately, he would never say this publicly, well, why 21? He said, 3 times 7 equals 21. And he would have, why'd you pick that number? Well, it's a lucky number, right? And people would, his advisors would write about this privately. He said there'd be a revolution if people knew that this is how he was determining the price of gold, trying to determine it. Really failed, by the way. He thought he could control it, and he really, he couldn't control it in this way. It was the arrogance of Roosevelt who thought he could control this massive economy. And people would say that, but apparently Roosevelt really did have superstitions. He had things like lucky shoes and lucky hats. He was very kind of superstitious in that way, interestingly enough. So it played into the superstition. Warren was the name of the economist. Yes.
Warren, gotcha.
Yeah, Frederick Warren. And he's not remembered now. And even people that, leading economists that, I have some disagreements with, like Keynes, would write about Warren, said this guy's, he called it the New Deal on the gold standard on booze, is what Keynes called it. Like, there's no, it makes no sense. Now, the big thing in reference to gold in the 1930s that really prevents the Depression from being worse is we're getting a massive gold inflow. And it's coming through two reasons FDR has nothing to do with. One, a lot of Jews are fleeing Nazi Germany and bringing their gold with them. And the Russians, the Soviets during that time are they have a lot of gold, and they're using that to purchase industrial goods, to industrialize their economy. So a lot of gold is flowing into the United States. So it's sort of an interesting situation that this kind of prevents the Great Depression from being a lot worse than it could have been, because you're getting this big gold inflow, because someone said because of Hitler and Stalin,
right,
unintentionally are big beneficiaries of U.S. growth during this, or at least of preventing the Great Depression from getting even worse. And it was bad throughout the 30s, double-digit unemployment, but it could have been worse.
It's amazing. I think you wrote that at one point there was one stat where unemployment was 23%, like one fourth of the workforce is no longer working. But there were all these programs, CCC, these huge government programs that put people trying to get people back to work. One of the interesting things that FDR established with himself, I don't know if it was present before his presidency, but his ability to communicate was really one of his real assets. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes. It's not only ability to communicate, he's got this persona. And I talked with older people, who grew up during this time years ago, and a lot of them would sort of say, would say things like, you know, he didn't really have to do this, right? He could have just enjoyed his estate and so forth. So there are a lot of people who felt this is aristocrat and he's kind of looking out for us. I kind of call him Thurston Howell III with a heart, right? In a way. And it's an interesting comparison you could make, but he has this Harvard accent. He has this aristocratic demeanor, and he has that, right? Which I think is much more effective than someone who would be haranguing people or trying to be a populist. He knew what he was. He was an aristocrat, and he played to that strength very effectively. But he would engage. He was very different than Trump and more effective than Trump in that he wouldn't personalize things as much. He wouldn't go out and attack Jimmy Kimmel, right? He wouldn't say, well, we got to get that guy off the air. The FCC's got to do something about that guy. He would never say that. But behind the scenes, his buffers are making phone calls to the networks and are effectively getting people removed from the air, and including a guy named Bo Carter, who's the leading radio commentator, very anti-FDR, on network radio. And by 1938, there is not a single anti-New Deal commentator left on network radio. Yes, some small fry in the local stations and stuff, but the networks, none left, even though most newspapers are very critical of FDR editorially. So it's interesting, but he does that by never personalizing it, rarely personalizing. He does sometimes, but someone said you almost felt good if he attacked you, right? Because he did it with such finesse, right? Yeah. But he would do it in a kind of implied way, he would say, these Republicans are doing this, and he'd make a joke about it, right? He wouldn't go, that senator, is doing this and this, and that guy's an idiot. Or, he would never do that.
Insult them personally, right?
Very rarely. And that was part of his effectiveness, I think.
So he would go after certain people, but also promote other people. I think Father Coughlin, you wrote, was another kind of person who was a supporter of FDR, who he supported even though he was a Catholic. So it is interesting that some of these other voices he promoted, and then others I think you wrote in your book also, he was one of the first presidents to sic the IRS on people too, if they were antagonistic towards him. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's what his son, I think it was Elliot, or I forget, maybe James, one of his sons said, when this was during the 70s when Nixon was using the IRS to attack political opponents. And he said, my father practically invented doing that, right? And gave examples. You gave an interesting example of Father Coughlin, who was a rabble-rouser, kind of populist, who was he had briefly been on network radio, but he was mainly on independent, smaller stations. He would assemble them together. He would send transcriptions to these stations, and he reached millions of people. And initially, FDR was promoted him, was very pro-Coughlin, and they only broke a little bit later. So it took some time for that to happen. But anyway, FDR definitely would use the IRS. And of course, this could really sting because the top rate at the height of this is in the World War II is over 90%. The top rate is over 90%. It briefly gets close to 100%. I mean, it's really, and the only, and so you are tremendously vulnerable. Now, of course, the top people in the top rank do not pay that percentage unless they got really dumb legal advice. They would hire the best lawyers, and they would get tax shelters and that kind of thing. But they always had to be on their toes because the government is always looking over their shoulder. So the IRS is very much used as a political weapon to reward and to punish.
Right. There was another scandal that I read about that I hadn't heard about. It was the Key West tragedy that Ernest Hemingway talked about. Like, this was another scandal that I don't think has hit. At least I wasn't aware of it. Can you talk about that?
Oh, I wasn't aware of it either until, not that many years ago. Now, if anyone knows anything about, the 1930s, one of the things they probably know about is the bonus marchers, right? Who came to Washington, and it kind of Hoover even though there's a lot of debate about that. But anyway, the army goes in and forces the bonus marchers out, and there are these riots, and and the the community the bonus marchers are created, the shanties is burned, and it really hurt Hoover during that campaign. So people know about the bonus marchers in that context, but what happens to the bonus marchers after the election? That's not often talked about. Well, FDR is very resistant to paying them a bonus as well, because it's expensive. He has his priorities in his New Deal programs. So what they do is they get scattered all around the country, working in various work camps, work projects. And some of them, these are, again, World War I veterans, not just bonus marchers, but World War I veterans. They get jobs in Key West on some of these New Deal projects, building roads and that kind of thing. Well, they're kind of abandoned there, really. There isn't much supervision. And there's a big hurricane in 1935. There are all kinds of warning it's coming. And there really isn't anything done to get these people out of the way. And they are slammed by the hurricane, and over 200 of them die. And it's just horrific. Time magazine sent a reporter there, said it was something like out of World War I, body parts everywhere. It was just horrible. Ernest Hemingway lived in Key West at the time. He could observe what was happening, and he basically said, this is murder, and he blamed Roosevelt, and he blamed Hopkins, who was the head of the New Deal, kind of welfare work relief programs, and it was kind of a big deal. Got a lot of attention. And it was a bit of a scandal. But again, Roosevelt is able to kind of ride it out, partly because the Senate investigation or the House investigation of this is run by a very strong New Dealer who is able to kind of choreograph it and prevent it from getting out of control. But this is a very big scandal. And again, far more people died, bonus marchers or veterans died in that situation than in 1932 during the protests. Far more, by multiples of whatever. But again, it's not written about a lot, as you said. Doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yeah, I don't recall that. Bartow Films asked, was FDR pro or anti-central banking, i.e. the Federal Reserve Bank? Can you address that question?
It's interesting. The Federal Reserve, he doesn't pay a lot of attention to the Federal Reserve. He kind of puts his focus on other programs. It's just not something he pays that much attention to. He doesn't really make much use of monetary policy, and to some extent, he doesn't really buy into a lot of the leading economists during the time, like Keynes, really don't think monetary policy. They don't tend to think it's that important. They're more into spending programs, reemployment programs, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of a backwater. So is he pro or anti? I don't really know how to answer that question. I don't think the Federal Reserve is something he focuses on. Now, he does focus a lot on banking, and some of his policies on banking are quite interesting. One of the most famous one, of course, is the banking holiday. But he might have been able to avoid that because Canada and FDR would have been aware of this, did not have a single banking failure during the Great Depression. Not one. The U.S. had, I don't know, thousands. It had a lot of banking failures, waves of banking failures. Why the difference? Well, one difference is Canadian banks could branch. So you wouldn't have these rural banks that would go under because the local rural economy went under. They were in branches. They were part of national, banks. So the weaker branch could bail out, the stronger branch could bail out the weaker one, and sort of a kind of mutual insurance, I guess you'd say. And Roosevelt had opportunities to bring a program like that to the U.S. And again, he wasn't interested in it. So that, it's sort of an interesting example of how the banking crisis, which is getting just out of control in the 3 months before Roosevelt is sworn in, he doesn't lift a finger to do anything about that. And he tells people, let it all collapse. And when it collapses, we'll rebuild, right? But there were opportunities for him during that period to do stuff to maybe soften the blow. Like, for example, adopting the Canadian system. There was a bill to do that. Again, they showed no interest in that.
Did you get the sense of his career in the 30s that he saw this as this kind of breakdown and the Depression and things like that as a place of opportunity, not as a place of like permanent, dislocation or something? Like, he saw the breakdown of this stuff and the financial breakdown as a means for him to reshape things and also enhance his own reputation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and asking the question, it sounds like a cynical question, but the answer is a cynical one, yes. And, something about Roosevelt that was recognized by a lot of people, including pro-Roosevelt historians, but none other than Harry Truman. Harry Truman called Roosevelt the coldest man I ever knew. He didn't care about you. He didn't care about me. And then Truman ends on this kind of weird note. But he brought the country into the 20th century. And Truman said that about Roosevelt. And it really is true. Beneath the demeanor, which is very warm, if you go into a room, you feel like he's on your side. And then someone who disagrees with you go into the room, they feel the same way. He's very personable, very effective, but there's a coldness there. There's a kind of icy ruthlessness, cynicism that you see. And I think Truman is the authority I'd appeal to on this. In fact, I was thinking of calling the book The Coldest Man, but my publisher said, no, don't do that. So I didn't. But, that gives you a little bit of a sense that who was he at the core? I mean, well, okay, let's look at that period there, the transition period. As I said, he told more than one person, well, let the banks go under. Let it go. Let everything collapse. They deserve it, right? And he would just sit there during this period when President Hoover is going to him and say, hey, let's work together. Let's come up with a common statement. Roosevelt's attitude is, no, we're not doing anything. And this is the worst time for the economy. And he is not lifting a finger. And you got to remember how long that transition is. The election is in November. He doesn't take office till March. So it was a much longer transition than it is now. And it's when the country is probably the worst it's ever been in terms of the economics of the country.
Wow, so he just lets it go. Now, you mentioned Truman. Philip asks, who did FDR want to succeed him, Harry Truman or Henry Wallace?
Okay, complicated answer. I think Roosevelt liked Wallace, although Wallace was kind of an odd duck in his sort of certain ways. He had a fascination with Eastern mysticism and so forth. But he's an intelligent man. He's a leftist. He was a very strong New Dealer. I think Roosevelt liked Wallace. I think Roosevelt would have preferred for Wallace to be on the ticket. But I think he was being pulled in other directions. These big city bosses, the big funders to the party, went to Roosevelt and they basically said this is going to be a tough election, 1944. Wallace is a drag. You need to replace him. Now, Roosevelt doesn't agree with them, though, completely. He sort of gives them the green light to find somebody to run against Wallace at the convention, but he opens the convention up. And frankly, I think he was hoping that Wallace might pull it out, but he kind of abandoned him. But I think he sort of Wallace ran anyway, and Wallace actually led on the first ballot at the convention, but he eventually lost. And I think there were a lot of reasons for that. One is Wallace, I got to give the guy some credit. Wallace at the convention came out against the poll tax. He made some very pro-civil rights statements and things, and those might have sunk him. So Wallace had a certain belief and principle that did him in, and he didn't campaign very well. Roosevelt sent him out of the country in the 3 months before the convention on a worldwide tour. So all this machinations, all this plotting to remove him was going on when he was out of the country. So I think that Roosevelt would have probably liked him to be there, but he wasn't going to fight for him. And he also recognized that he was a drag. He was no great friend of Truman. I think he met with Truman maybe 2 times after he became president, and they were not meetings of any importance. He never sat down Truman and said, by the way, I'm dying. My doctors say I'm dying. You're going to be president soon. By the way, I've got this atomic bomb thing going on here. He never did anything like that.
Right.
And he was dying. Roosevelt was a health disaster, right? But it was covered up. You talk about the cover up with Biden, and there was a very similar cover up during this time.
You can see him at Yalta. He does not look good. He almost doesn't even look like himself. And he's still smoking, too. I think he had a lit cigarette, which is pretty remarkable. I would think that would be one of the first things to stop.
Oh, he smoked like several packs a day, I think. And
yeah.
He might have cut back Camels, and he might have cut back a little bit because of the doctors, but he still smoked. He was just a mess. I mean, the last guy to meet with him was Morgenthau. Met him a couple days before he died, and he said his hands were shaking so much that Morgenthau had to pour the glass for him, glass of wine, because Roosevelt just couldn't manage it.
Was that because he had Parkinson's?
His last inauguration speech in 1945 was the shortest on record. I forget how many minutes. It's like 10 minutes or something. It was incredibly short because he just didn't have the ability to do that anymore.
Did he have Parkinson's? Is that why he was shaking?
That's a good question. I think he just had. I've never heard that he had Parkinson's, but he had a very severe heart condition. He had a number of different health maladies, and he had a doctor who was a quack. He had a doctor who was a courtier doctor who told him whatever he wanted. Roosevelt liked this doctor because he had treated his sinuses effectively, and he actually promoted him to be Surgeon General of the Navy. But Roosevelt's daughter insisted that he see a specialist from Johns Hopkins. And this guy's report was basically like, my God, this guy's
a mess.
This is during the campaign, but they covered it up. They covered it up.
Yeah. He doesn't look good in some of those late pictures. It's pretty incredible. I have a listener who sent me a list of 12 questions. I will be in trouble if I don't ask you at least one of them. One of the questions is interesting because it was a time where they seemed to have some kind of, he liked Mussolini, I think you mentioned in your book, where he had some affinity for him. The question is, during both the New Deal and the war, American government adopted bureaucratic and economic controls resembling those used in fascist Italy, National Socialist Germany, and the USSR. Was this a case of conscious modeling on foreign fascist political organizations, or just a technocratic approach that all of these countries were using? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Probably a little bit of both, but they were certainly aware of what was going on. Italy especially, because of course Italy had been doing this for several years, right? Hitler was just coming to power in 1933. And so Roosevelt, would send messages to his new ambassador to Italy. He said, please give my greetings to that fine Italian gentleman, namely Mussolini. Some of the key New Dealers like Rexford Tugwell would say, I envy what they're doing in Italy, and a lot of things. You can see them, the kind of corporatist idea, right? Big business, big labor, big government cooperating with each other to manage the economy, um, that kind of thing. So they're very influenced by that, and initially they're pretty open about it. So Mussolini in particular is somebody that Roosevelt, he does admire him. He later turns against him, but that isn't till the Ethiopian War, 1935. Fascism is, and the admiration is mutual. You can find a lot of Mussolini is praising the New Deal and Roosevelt, and Hitler is as well, and saying, Roosevelt just goes against all the lobbies. He overcomes them. He marches straight to his destination. Very positive commentary about what he's doing with the New Deal, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Another question is, Roosevelt granted major concessions to Stalin at Tehran and Yalta that reshaped the post-war balance of power. Does this reflect, quote, the sick man of Yalta, unquote, the influence of figures such as Alger Hiss, or Roosevelt's own desire to give away so much?
I would say I would lean, I don't know about to give away, but to be trusting. I mean, Roosevelt really thought he could charm Stalin and that Stalin liked him. And Roosevelt told a story after Tehran. He said, well, I walked over to, I talked to Mr. Marshal Stalin and said that some people in our country call you Uncle Joe. Do you mind if we call you that here? And according to Roosevelt, Stalin was just very flattered by this and walked over to shake his hand. Now, some of the accounts from what Stalin actually thought were, he just was very cynical about this guy who thought he was going to be able to play him. But Roosevelt really thought that he could play Stalin, but he was also very trusting in Stalin. And he didn't use weapons that were available to him. One of the weapons that was available to Roosevelt throughout was Lend-Lease money. We gave the Soviet Union billions, and we're still giving them billions at the time of Yalta, 1945. He could have threatened to withhold that money, and he could have gotten probably a lot of concessions. And by the way, he wasn't adverse to doing that because he wanted to get Churchill to agree to this really, this draconian plan called the Morgenthau Plan to deindustrialize Germany, to, as Roosevelt said, castrate Germany, to turn it into an agricultural economy. And Churchill didn't like it. And Roosevelt sort of held out very cynically. Well, he didn't say this directly, but Churchill understood it this way, that Lend-Lease money to the United Kingdom might not just go through unless Churchill agreed to the Morgenthau Plan, and Churchill ended up agreeing to it quite reluctantly and signed on to it, but did not like it at all. He compared it to chaining Britain to dead Germans. That was his reaction to this plan, which was essentially, we're going to punish Germany and we're going to make it so they can never come back ever, right? Because it's in their genes, right?
Right.
They're going to go to war again if we don't punish them.
It's really interesting the way that everything played out. I mean, I wouldn't say the Morgenthau Plan was implemented, but there's a lot of stuff that's left out of history of what happened after 1945.
No, he had to back off. This is Roosevelt, the politician. This is during the campaign of 44. It proved quite unpopular, and he had a Republican he wanted to beat who played up on this, just how terrible the plan was. No one in Roosevelt, very few people in Roosevelt's cabinet liked it, and he backed off. And he blamed Morgenthau for it later. He said, use the expression, pulling a boner, right? Which had a different meaning back then. He said, boy, Henry Morgenthau pulled a boner on that one. But then a day before he died, he was meeting with Morgenthau, and Morgenthau repeated the plan. He says, we got to bring back this plan. And Roosevelt said, Henry, I agree with you 100%. So even Eleanor said that the Morgenthau plan was the way he wanted to go, and maybe the way he would have gone, but he had to back off during the campaign because there was such reaction against it politically. The politician always, takes control in a situation like that with Roosevelt.
Just one more question. Roosevelt repeatedly bypassed the State Department and relied on parallel secret channels of diplomacy. What does this pattern reveal about his respect for democratic oversight in foreign policy? Is there any validity to that question? Oh, I think we lost him. David, we lost you. I blanked. Anyway, the book name of the book again is FDR: A New Political Life. The author again is David T. Beito, Beito. We made it 55 minutes. Thanks for everybody listening. I didn't really,
Oh, okay, you're back again.
You're back. Okay, sorry about that.
I don't know what that was all about.
Okay,
It
was probably on my end. I'm in a hotel. Did you hear the question? Or
yeah, wasn't it him bypassing Hull?
Yeah, is there any validity to that?
Yeah, I think there's some validity to it. And interestingly enough, Hull was a kind of a free trade guy, kind of a guy that was sort of anti-New Deal in some ways. But Roosevelt kind of felt he had a lot of support. He made him Secretary of State, because he had appealed to all these different elements. But then he proceeded to kind of ignore Hull. And for a long time during his administration, Roosevelt was pursuing, was sort of giving encouragement to protectionists, very Trumpian type people, by the way, who were pushing a protectionist agenda. And things were going badly downhill during that time. And eventually, Roosevelt kind of gives in to Hull, but he always keeps him at arm's length on a lot of things. He'll go along with Hull if he agrees with him, but Hull is really on the Morgenthau plan is another example of that. Hull didn't like it, but Roosevelt will rely on other people. The big guy he relied a lot on was Harry Hopkins. That was a guy that he even lived at the White House. He moved in. He had his own room at the White House. And Hopkins was somebody that Roosevelt would listen to. And there were some people like that. But he sort of froze them out. He had kind of an informal network of people he would rely on like that.
Interesting. So he kind of used standard channels, but also kind of a backdoor, maybe diplomacy. What do they call private diplomacy is a way to term it. David, we are at the 60-minute mark. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap it up?
No, it's just that I think if you want I think there'll be some new things in the book. Maybe you'll agree with that people haven't seen before. It's concise. And I had a lot of fun. Writing it. And I don't make direct comparisons between FDR and other presidents for the most part. But I think when you read the book, you will see these comparisons come through. So it was quite enjoyable.
Wait, there's one more question you showed up. Bartow says, was the Marshall Plan based or connected to the Morgenthau Plan? Do you have any thoughts on that? No?
I really stopped in 1945 and didn't focus a lot on that. Was it connected with it? I don't know, because Truman is pursuing a much softer policy towards Germany than Roosevelt would have pursued. So I think you could have imagined that if Roosevelt had lived, he might have had something like the Marshall Plan, but I don't think he would have had very favorable terms for Germany. I think he did really want to punish them and set them back industrially, and just thought, he gave no encouragement to plotters against Hitler. One of the great negatives about Roosevelt is there were opportunities to overthrow Hitler, but he blew off the people that were trying to do this because he saw, they're part of the problem. They are Prussians or whatever. So he wanted to uproot the whole thing.
Wow, fascinating. I didn't know about that. I know that Dulles was involved in all that stuff.
Yes, he was. Some interesting things to say about this, about the discontent that was occurring in Germany, that there was all sorts of opportunities for some sort of coup. But the coup plotters wanted some sort of assurance that we were going to let up on the doctrine of unconditional surrender. because they said, look, our troops are going to fight to the death if they know that it's unconditional surrender. But Roosevelt wouldn't give that assurance. In fact, he kind of was a little jocular, kind of joking around a little bit about the plotters. And, some of them were just horribly tortured, like von Stauffenberg and others. Well, he wasn't let's put it this way, he wasn't very sympathetic to them. He wasn't very encouraging.
It's a shame because it could have stopped another year. It was June 1944, and those people got killed with piano wire, like really horrible stuff.
Not just that, but the Holocaust. I mean, that really is ramping up in 43, 44 in a major way. And there were a lot of these Axis powers like Hungary and Romania that they wanted to put some distance. And Romania said, we got like 100,000 Jews. You want them? The Vatican can come and, fly a Vatican flag as long as you transport them. But there were these Axis allies that were sort of getting skittish, like they knew which way the war was going. And another one was in Hungary, Admiral Horthy. And there were windows of opportunity to save some of these Jews, but it was like unconditional surrender. Roosevelt was just very rigid. He wasn't going to even talk about it.
Wow.
And that, had tragic consequences in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think that the ethnic cleansing of Budapest took place either in late 44 or 1945. So if Hitler would have been overthrown, there was like a huge slaughter in Budapest that would have been saved. I think
if we'd have made a deal with the Hungarians early enough, we might have been able to get a lot of those Jews out of there, because they wanted out of the Axis, and this was one way they felt they could keep going, make a deal.
There's so much to learn from history. It could have gone one way or the other. I think that's the thing about FDR. His personality affected everything, his sensibilities, and affected his life, and so much in history and American history. So people check out this book. It's available now on Amazon. I think it was released on Amazon on November 25th, 2025. You can get it on Kindle or paperback. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then if anybody has any follow-up questions for you or wants to reach out to you, is there a good place? I think we talked in the pre-show. You have a Twitter account and a Facebook account.
I do, and they can write me an email, davidtbeito@gmail.com.
It's Beito. It's David T. Beito @gmail.com. People can follow that. Thanks so much. What a great talk, and I really appreciate you coming back on the show. And the new book, again, is FDR, A New Political Life. And the author, again, is David T. Beito, Beito. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, stay there.